The Baroque is often thought of as a period of artistic style that used exaggerated motion and clear, easily interpreted detail to produce drama, tension, exuberance, and grandeur in sculpture, painting, architecture, literature, dance, theatre, and music. The style began around 1600 in Rome, Italy, and spread to most of Europe. The popularity and success of the Baroque style was encouraged by the Catholic Church, which had decided at the time of the Council of Trent, in response to the Protestant Reformation, that the arts should communicate religious themes in direct and emotional involvement. The aristocracy also saw the dramatic style of Baroque architecture and art as a means of impressing visitors and expressing triumph, power and control. Baroque palaces are built around an entrance of courts, grand staircases and reception rooms of sequentially increasing opulence. However, Baroque has resonance and application that extend beyond a simple reduction to either style or period. Etymology. The French word baroque is derived from the Portuguese word barroco, or Spanish baruco, both of which refer to a rough or imperfect pearl, though whether it entered those languages via Latin, Arabic, or some other source is uncertain. It is also yields the Italian barocco, and modern Spanish barroco, German baroque, Dutch baroque, and so on. The 1911 Encyclopaedia Britannica 11th edition thought the term was derived from the Spanish baruco, a large, irregularly shaped pearl, and that it had for a time been confined to the craft of the jeweler. Others derive it from the mnemonic term barroco, a supposedly labored form of syllogism in logical scholastica. The Latin root can be found in bis rocca. In informal usage, the word baroque can simply mean that something is elaborate, with many details. Without reference to the Baroque styles of the 17th and 18th centuries, the word baroque, like most periodic or stylistic designations, was invented by later critics rather than practitioners of the arts in the 17th and early 18th centuries. It is a French transliteration of the Portuguese phrase "perala barroca," which means irregular pearl. Unnatural pearls that deviate from the usual, regular form so they do not have an axis of rotation are known as baroque pearls. The term baroque was initially used in a derogatory sense, to underline the excesses of its emphasis. In particular, the term was used to describe its eccentric redundancy and noisy abundance of details, which sharply contrasted the clear and sober rationality of the Renaissance. Although it was long thought that the word as a critical term was first applied to architecture, in fact it appears earlier in reference to music. In an anonymous, satirical review of the premiere in October 1733 of Jean-Philippe Rameau's Hippolyte et Aracie, printed in the Mercure de France in May 1734, the critic implied that the novelty in this opera was du baroque, complaining that the music lacked coherent melody, was unsparing with dissonances, constantly changed key and meter, and speedily ran through every compositional device. Modern taste and usage. The Swiss-born art historian, Heinrich Wölfflin, started the rehabilitation of the word Baroque in his Renaissance and Baroque. Wölfflin identified the Baroque as movement imported into mass, an art antithetic to Renaissance art. He did not make the distinctions between mannerism and Baroque that modern writers do, and he ignored the later phase, the academic Baroque that lasted into the 18th century. Long despised, Baroque art and architecture became fashionable between the two world wars, and has largely remained in critical favor. For example, the often extreme Sicilian Baroque architecture is today recognized largely due to the work of Sacheverell Sitwell, whose Southern Baroque art of 1924 was the first book to appreciate the style, followed by the more academic work of Anthony Blunt. In painting, the gradual rise in popular esteem of Caravaggio has been the best barometer of modern taste. In art history it has become common to recognize Baroque stylistic phases, characterized by energetic movement and display, in earlier art. so that Sir John Boardman describes the ancient sculpture Laocoon and his sons as one of the finest examples of the Hellenistic Baroque, and a later phase of Imperial Roman sculpture is also often called Baroque. William Watson describes a late phase of Shang dynasty Chinese ritual bronzes of the 11th century BC as Baroque. The term Baroque may still be used, usually pejoratively, describing works of art, craft, or design that have thought to have excessive ornamentation or complexity of line development. The Baroque originated around 1600, several decades after the Council of Trent, by which the Roman Catholic Church answered many questions of internal reform, addressed the representational arts by demanding that paintings and sculptures in church contexts should speak to the illiterate rather than to the well-informed. This turn toward a populist conception of the function of ecclesiastical art is seen by many art historians as driving the innovations of Caravaggio, and brothers Agostino and Annibale Carracci, all of whom were working in Rome around 1600. The appeal of Baroque style turned consciously from the witty, intellectual qualities of 16th-century mannerist art to a visceral appeal aimed at the senses. It employed an iconography that was direct, simple, obvious, and theatrical. Baroque art drew on certain broad and heroic tendencies in Annibale Carracci and his circle, and found inspiration in other artists like Correggio and Caravaggio and Federico Barocci, nowadays sometimes termed proto-Baroque. Germinal ideas of the Baroque can also be found in the work of Michelangelo. Some general parallels in music make the expression Baroque music useful. There are contrasting phrase lengths, harmony and counterpoint have ousted polyphony, and orchestral color makes a stronger appearance. Even more generalized parallels perceived by some experts in philosophy, prose style and poetry are harder to pinpoint. Though Baroque was superseded in many centers by the Rococo style, beginning in France in the late 1720s, especially for interiors. See the Neapolitan Palace of Caserta, a Baroque palace whose construction began in 1752. In paintings, Baroque gestures are broader than Mannerist gestures, less ambiguous, less arcane and mysterious, more like the stage gestures of opera, a major Baroque art form. Baroque poses depend on contrapposto, the tension within the figures that move the planes of shoulders and hips in counter directions. See Bernini's David. The drier, less dramatic and coloristic, chastened later stages of 18th-century Baroque architectural style are often seen as a separate late Baroque manifestation. For example in buildings by Claude Perrault. Academic characteristics in the Neo-Palladian style, epitomized by William Kent, are a parallel development in Britain and the British colonies. Within interiors, Kent's furniture designs are vividly influenced by the Baroque furniture of Rome and Genoa. Hierarchical tectonic sculptural elements, meant never to be moved from their positions, completed the wall decoration. Baroque is a style of unity imposed upon rich, heavy detail. The Baroque was defined by Heinrich Wülflin as the age where the oval replaced the circle as the center of composition. That centralization replaced balance, and that coloristic and painterly effects began to become more prominent. Art historians, often Protestant ones, have traditionally emphasized that the Baroque style evolved during a time in which the Roman Catholic Church had to react against the many revolutionary cultural movements that produced a new science and new forms of religion, Reformation. It has been said that the monumental Baroque is a style that could give the papacy, like secular absolute monarchies, a formal, imposing way of expression that could restore its prestige, at the point of becoming somehow symbolic of the Counter-Reformation. Whether this is the case or not, it was successfully developed in Rome, where Baroque architecture widely renewed the central areas with perhaps the most important urbanistic revision. Periods. The Baroque era is sometimes divided into roughly three phases for convenience. Early Baroque, 1590 c. 1625. High Baroque, 1625 c. 1660. Late Baroque, 1660 c. 1725. Late Baroque is also sometimes used synonymously with the succeeding Rococo movement. Painting. A defining statement of what Baroque signifies in painting is provided by the series of paintings executed by Peter Paul Rubens for Marie de Medici, at the Luxembourg Palace in Paris, in which a Catholic painter satisfied a Catholic patron. Baroque-era conceptions of monarchy, iconography, handling of paint, and compositions, as well as the depiction of space and movement. Baroque style featured exaggerated lighting, intense emotions, release from restraint, and even a kind of artistic sensationalism. Baroque art did not really depict the lifestyle of the people at that time, however, closely tied to the Counter-Reformation. This style melodramatically reaffirmed the emotional depths of the Catholic faith and glorified both church and monarchy, of their power and influence. There were highly diverse strands of Italian Baroque painting, from Caravaggio to Cortona, both approaching emotive dynamism with different styles. Another frequently cited work of Baroque art is Bernini's Saint Theresa in Ecstasy for the Cordero Chapel in St. Maria della Vittoria, which brings together architecture, sculpture, and theatre into one grand conceit. The later Baroque style gradually gave way to a more decorative Rococo, a rather different art developed out of Northern Realist traditions in 17th-century Dutch Golden Age painting, which had very little religious art and little history painting, instead playing a crucial part in developing secular genres such as still life, genre paintings of everyday scenes, and landscape painting. While the Baroque nature of Rembrandt's art is clear, the label is less often used for Vermeer and many other Dutch artists. Flemish Baroque painting shared a part in this trend, while all also continuing to produce the traditional categories. In a similar way, the French classical style of painting exemplified by Poussin is often classed as Baroque, and does share many qualities of the Italian painting of the same period, although the poise and restraint derived from following classical ideas typically give it a very different overall mood. Sculpture. In Baroque sculpture, groups of figures assumed new importance and there was a dynamic movement and energy of human forms. They spiraled around an empty central vortex, or reached outwards into the surrounding space. For the first time, Baroque sculpture often had multiple ideal viewing angles. The characteristic Baroque sculpture added extra sculptural elements, for example, concealed lighting, or water fountains. Aleijadinho in Brazil was also one of the great names of Baroque sculpture, and his masterwork is the set of statues of the Santuario de Bom Jesus de Matosinhos in Congonhas. The soapstone sculptures of Old Testament prophets around the Terça are considered amongst his finest work. The architecture, sculpture and fountains of Bernini give highly charged characteristics of Baroque style. Bernini was undoubtedly the most important sculptor of the Baroque period. He approached Michelangelo in his omnicompetence. Bernini sculpted, worked as an architect, painted, wrote plays, and staged spectacles. In the late 20th century, Bernini was most valued for his sculpture, both for his virtuosity in carving marble and his ability to create figures that combine the physical and the spiritual. He was also a fine sculptor of bust portraits in high demand among the powerful. Bernini's Cordero Chapel. A good example of Bernini's Baroque work is his St. Theresa in Ecstasy, created for the Cordero Chapel of the Church of Santa Maria della Vittoria, Rome. Bernini designed the entire chapel, a subsidiary space along the side of the church, for the Cornaro family. Saint Theresa, the focal point of the chapel, is a soft white marble statue surrounded by a polychromatic marble architectural framing. This structure conceals a window which lights the statue from above. Figure groups of the Cordero family sculpted in shallow relief inhabit opera boxes on the two side walls of the chapel. The setting places the viewer as a spectator in front of the statue, with the Cordero family leaning out of their boxed seats and craning forward to see the mystical ecstasy of the saint. Saint Theresa is highly idealized and in an imaginary setting. She was a popular saint of the Catholic Reformation. She wrote of her mystical experiences for an audience of the nuns of her Carmelite order. These writings had become popular reading among lay people interested in spirituality. In her writings, she described the love of God as piercing her heart like a burning arrow. Bernini materializes this by placing St. Theresa on a butt while a Cupid figure holds a golden arrow made of metal and smiles down at her. The angelic figure is not preparing to plunge the arrow into her heart, rather, he has withdrawn it. St. Theresa's face reflects not the anticipation of ecstasy, but her current fulfillment. This work is widely considered a masterpiece of the Baroque, although the mix of religious and erotic imagery may raise modern eyebrows. However, Bernini was a devout Catholic and was not attempting to satirize the experience of a chaste nun. Rather, he aimed to portray religious experience as an intensely physical one. Theresa described her bodily reaction to spiritual enlightenment in a language of ecstasy used by many mystics, and Bernini's depiction is earnest. The Cornaro family promotes itself discreetly in this chapel. They are represented visually, but are placed on the sides of the chapel, witnessing the event from balconies. As in an opera house, the Cornaro have a privileged position in respect to the viewer. In the private reserve, closer to the saint, the viewer, however, has a better view from the front. They attach their name to the chapel, but St. Theresa is the focus. It is a private chapel in the sense that no one could say Mass on the altar beneath the statue without permission from the family. But the only thing that divides the viewer from the image is the altar rail. The spectacle functions both as a demonstration of mysticism and as a piece of family pride. Architecture. In Baroque architecture, new emphasis was placed on bold massing, colonnades, domes, light and shade, painterly, color effects, and the bold play of volume and void. In interiors, Baroque movement around and through a void and formed monumental staircases that had no parallel in previous architecture. The other Baroque innovation in worldly interiors was the state apartment, a sequence of increasingly rich interiors that culminated in a presence chamber or throne room or a state bedroom. The sequence of monumental stairs followed by a state apartment was copied in smaller scale everywhere in aristocratic dwellings of any pretensions. Baroque architecture was taken up with enthusiasm in central Germany, Austria and Russia. In England, the culmination of Baroque architecture was embodied in work by Sir Christopher N., Sir John Vanbrugh and Nicholas Hawksmoor, from California, 1660 to California, 1725. Many examples of Baroque architecture and town planning are found in other European towns, and in Latin America. Town planning of this period featured radiating avenues intersecting in squares, which took cues from Baroque garden plans. In Sicily, Baroque developed new shapes and themes as in Noto, Ragusa and Asirial, Basilica di San Sebastiano. Another example of Baroque architecture is the Cathedral of Morelia, Michoacán in Mexico. Built in the 17th century by Vincenzo Barocchio, it is one of the many Baroque cathedrals in Mexico. Baroque churches are also seen in the Philippines, which were built during the Spanish period. Francis Ching described Baroque architecture as a style of architecture originating in Italy in the early 17th century and variously prevalent in Europe and the New World for a century and a half. Characterized by free and sculptural use of the classical orders and ornament, dynamic opposition and interpenetration of spaces, and the dramatic combined effects of architecture, sculpture, painting, and the decorative arts. Architecture. Winter Palace. Trevi Fountain in Rome. Wilanów Palace in Warsaw. Interior of the Cordero Chapel. Santa Maria della Vittoria Church, Rome, including the Cordero portraits, but omitting the lower parts of the chapel.